Welcome, brave souls. Tonight, we step into the forgotten halls of despair, where whispers echo through crumbling corridors and shadows move when no one's there. Hospitals, the very places meant to save lives, sometimes become prisons for restless souls. These are the places where pain lingered, where screams were swallowed by stone walls, and where death wasn't an ending, but a beginning of something far darker. Across America, abandoned asylums and sanatoriums sit like scars on the land-rotting giants filled with secrets. Once filled with patients seeking hope, they now house something else entirely. Spirits, shadows, the echoes of agony that refuse to fade. Some people say these buildings remember every shock of the electrotherapy, every silent tear in the night, and every last breath taken behind locked doors. But tonight, you'll hear the stories. You'll feel the chill of their history. And maybe you'll sense them listening to us. Because when you speak their names, they listen. So turn off the lights, lock your doors, and keep your headphones on. These are the 20 most haunted hospitals in America where the dead never checked out. Waverly Hills Sanatorium looms over Louisville like a shadow from another time, a decaying reminder of an era when hope and despair lived side by side. Built in 1910, this massive Gothic structure was designed to combat one of the deadliest diseases of the early 20th century, tuberculosis, known as the White Plague. It swept across America, claiming thousands of lives in horrifying waves. Louisville, Kentucky, was hit hard, and Waverly Hills became the city's last line of defense. But for most who entered its halls, it was not a sanctuary yet. It was a final destination. The sanatorium was considered state-of-the-art for its time, perched high on a hill where fresh air was thought to be the cure. Patients were placed on open-air porches year-round, even in freezing winters, to breathe in the crisp Kentucky breeze. Doctors and nurses did what they could, but medicine had no true answer to tuberculosis then. Experimental treatments bordered on the brutal, collapsing lungs to let them rest, inserting balloons into the chest cavity, even removing ribs and muscle to give the lungs room to expand. Many patients endured multiple surgeries, often without anesthetics strong enough to dull the agony. For countless souls, death came as a relief. At its peak, Waverly Hills was its own little world, housing hundreds of patients, doctors, and staff. It had its own post office, its own zip code, even its own farm to feed the residents. But within this self-contained city, a grim reality lurched. Most who entered would never walk out alive. It is estimated that over 6,000 people died inside those walls. The hospital staff faced an impossible task. They had to maintain hope among the living while dealing with the relentless tide of death. To keep spirits high, they devised a chilling solution: the body chute, officially called the Death Tunnel. It was a 500-foot underground passage sloping down the hillside, with a motorized rail system that carried away the dead. Stretchers and carts rolled silently along the tracks, delivering corpses to hearses waiting at the bottom. This way, patients never saw the constant removal of bodies. They didn't hear the weeping families or smelled the scent of death that hung heavy in the halls. But even without seeing it, they felt it. The building itself absorbed that sorrow, and some say it never let go. When antibiotics finally brought tuberculosis under control in the 1940s, Waverly Hills closed as a sanatorium. But the story didn't end there. It reopened as a geriatric hospital in the 1960s, where reports of mistreatment and neglect soon surfaced. Patients were restrained for days at a time. Some were forgotten, left in isolation until death claimed them. After years of scandal and horror, the hospital finally closed for good in 1982. But the dead did not leave. Today, Waverly Hills is a crumbling giant, its windows gaping like empty eye sockets, its walls cracked and peeling. Yet it draws thousands of visitors each year: ghost hunters, thrill seekers, and those who simply cannot resist its dark allure. They come for the legends, and Waverly Hills has many. The most infamous spirit is a little girl known as Mary, seen playing with a leather ball in the shadowy hallways. Visitors have heard the soft thud of the ball bouncing on concrete floors when no one else was around. Some claim they've seen her peeking from doorways, her laughter echoing down the dark corridors before vanishing into silence. Then there is room 500, to arguably the most haunted spot in the building. In the 1920s, a young nurse allegedly discovered she was pregnant and unmarried. A scandal in those times. Overcome with despair, she hanged herself from a pipe in that very room. A few years later, another nurse jumped to her death from the same floor. Today, people report feeling sudden waves of nausea, dizziness, or dread when they enter 502. Some have even claimed they were pushed by unseen hands, as if the room itself wants to share its misery. In the death tunnel, shadows seem to move when no one is there. Paranormal investigators have captured voices whispering from the darkness, answering questions in chilling tones. Thermal cameras have picked up figures that vanish when approached. Skeptics dismiss these as tricks of the mind, but those who have walked the tunnel alone will tell you it feels alive. Perhaps the most disturbing tales involve the 5th floor, a place so drenched in tragedy that even seasoned investigators tread lightly. Disembodied voices call out names. Footsteps echo on empty floors. Doors slam with a force no wind could muster. Some visitors leave in tears, unable to explain why the air feels so heavy, why the walls seem to breathe with sorrow. Waverly Hills has become a legend, not because of what can be proven, but because of what can be felt. The building is a monument to suffering, a graveyard stacked floor upon floor. It holds the echoes of thousands of final breaths, the pain of lives cut short, and the fear of those who knew the end was near. Some believe these emotions seeped into the walls, creating a vortex of despair that feeds on anyone who enters. Even now, in the dead of night, if you stand in the hollow hallways of Waverly Hills, you may hear the distant sound of a gurney rolling across the floor. You may feel a cold hand brush against your arm or hear a child's laughter where no child should be. And if you listen closely at the mouth of the death tunnel, you might just hear the whispers of the forgotten calling out from the darkness, reminding the living that some places never let go. Would you like me to write more Waverly Hills stories like this but focused on the ghost encounters in detail for your voiceover? Or should I move on to another haunted hospital with the same style? The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum in Weston, West Virginia, stands as a monumental relic of a grim and tragic chapter in American mental health history. Founded in 1864, with the hope of providing refuge and treatment to the mentally ill, the asylum was originally designed to house just 250 patients. Its imposing Gothic architecture, sprawling grounds, and innovative intent represented a beacon of progress at the time. However, as the decades wore on, the institution descended into a nightmare fueled by overcrowding, neglect, and systemic abuse, transforming it into one of the darkest places in the nation. At the outset, the asylum was heralded as a humane alternative to the brutal conditions faced by many with mental illnesses, who were confined in prisons or poorhouses. The sprawling building was meant to be self-sufficient, boasting its own farmland, workshops, and recreational spaces. Patients were provided activities and fresh air, and staff believed in the principles of moral treatment of philosophy, emphasizing kindness and respect. But as the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the tide of patients surged far beyond capacity. By the 1950s, the asylum was home to over 2,400 individuals, nearly 10 times its intended population. This overwhelming overcrowding was a key factor in the institution's rapid deterioration. Wards meant to house a handful of patients became packed with dozens, with beds lining hallways and shared spaces. Staff numbers could not keep up with the swelling patient body, leading to insufficient care, unsanitary conditions, and widespread neglect. The asylum became a breeding ground for disease, despair, and dehumanization. Treatment methods employed at the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum were often harsh and experimental. Electroconvulsive therapy, or electroshock therapy, was a common practice, administered with little concern for patient comfort or consent. These treatments could induce seizures, memory loss, and physical pain. Ice water baths were another cruel method, where patients were submerged in freezing water to shock them into submission or calm violent outbursts. Perhaps most infamous were the lobotomy surgical procedures designed to sever connections in the brain's frontal lobe. Many patients underwent these operations, often resulting in permanent disability or death. The human cost of these practices, coupled with the conditions inside the asylum, was staggering. Hundreds of patients died within its walls, victims of illness, mistreatment, or outright neglect. Many were buried on the grounds in unmarked graves, their identities lost to time. The weight of so many lost lives seems to have left an imprint on the building itself, lingering sorrow that some say never left. In recent years, the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum has become a notorious hotspot for paranormal activity, attracting ghost hunters, investigators, and curious visitors. Reports of supernatural encounters abound, painting a picture of a place where the past is not only remembered, but still very much present. Visitors and investigators have claimed to see full-bodied apparitions wandering the halls, ghostly figures dressed in period clothing, some appearing confused or lost, others exhibiting visible distress. Some apparitions scream in anguish, their voices piercing the cold air and sending chills down the spine of anyone nearby. Others are silent watchers, their hollow eyes following visitors as they navigate the asylum's endless corridors. The fourth floor of the asylum is often cited as one of the most active areas. Here, visitors report doors slamming with no apparent cause, footsteps echoing on empty floors, and sudden drops in temperature. Many describe an oppressive atmosphere, a heavy energy that presses down on the spirit. It is said that this floor once housed some of the most disturbed patients, and their lingering pain seems palpable to this day. One particularly chilling phenomenon reported involves shadow figures that appear just out of the corner of the eye shapes that dart away when looked at directly. These shadows are sometimes accompanied by inexplicable noises, whispers, disembodied voices, or the distant clanging of metal. Visitors have recounted experiences of being touched or pushed by unseen hands, moments of disorientation, or sudden feelings of overwhelming sadness. The asylum's underground tunnels and basements add another layer of eerie intrigue. These dark, cramped passageways were used for patient transfers, storage, and utility purposes, and they have become prime locations for paranormal investigations. In the tunnels, people report hearing footsteps behind them, only to find no one there when they turn around. Strange lights and glowing orbs have been captured on camera, floating silently in the darkness. The tunnel's oppressive atmosphere has caused some investigators to cut their explorations short, overwhelmed by an unseen presence. Stories also abound about the lobotomy room, where many of the most tragic and invasive procedures took place. Visitors who enter this room describe an intense emotional weight, as if the walls themselves carry the anguish of those who suffered within. Some claim to hear faint surgical sounds, metal tools being set down, or whispered voices, though no one else is present. The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum's haunting reputation is not limited to the dead. Some visitors recount seeing or hearing the living apparitions of staff members who once cared for or controlled the patients. Nurses in white uniforms, doctors in lab coats, and even administrators have been glimpsed fleetingly, adding to the feeling that the asylum's entire history remains trapped within its walls. Despite its haunted legacy, the asylum today is also a place of education and preservation. Guided tours allow visitors to explore the grounds, while learning about the history of mental health care and the lives of those who live there. The hope is that, by remembering the past, both its progress and its horrors, society can better understand and improve mental health treatment in the future. Rolling Hills Asylum, nestled in the quiet town of East Bethany, New York, is a place where the echoes of forgotten lives linger in the air. Originally established as a poorhouse in the 1800s, it was meant to shelter society's most vulnerable criminals, orphans, the mentally ill, and the destitute. But over time, this institution became a place where many came to disappear, swallowed by silence and despair. Today, the crumbling walls and empty corridors are haunted by the restless spirits of those who never left, their stories etched into the fabric of the asylum's dark history. The origins of Rolling Hills are rooted in tragedy and neglect. Poor houses were designed as last resorts for those who had nowhere else to go, and Rolling Hills quickly became overcrowded as the population grew. The institution evolved into an asylum, a place to confine the mentally ill, many of whom were abandoned by families or deemed too dangerous for society. Conditions inside were grim. Resources were scarce, staff were overwhelmed, and the patients suffered from inadequate care, malnutrition, and isolation. More than 1,700 people who passed through Rolling Hills found their final resting place on its grounds. Buried in unmarked graves, their names and stories lost to time, they became silent witnesses to the suffering that unfolded within the asylum's walls. The grounds themselves seemed to hold the weight of this sorrow, and even now, visitors report an overwhelming sense of melancholy that settles over the property like a thick fog. The building's long, narrow hallways have become corridors of paranormal activity. Visitors often hear footsteps echoing where no one is walking, the steady rhythm of unseen feet moving through the shadows. Doors creak open and slam shut without explanation, as if invisible hands are stirring the air. Cold spots, sudden drops in temperature send shivers through those brave enough to explore after dark. These phenomena have made Rolling Hills a magnet for ghost hunters and thrill seekers, all eager to encounter the spirits said to haunt the asylum. Among the many ghost stories, one spirit stands out: Roy, the towering former patient whose presence has become a legend. Standing an estimated 7 feet tall in life, Roy is said to have roamed the asylum's halls long before it closed its doors. Numerous visitors and investigators claim to have seen his imposing shadow moving silently in the dimly lit corridors. Some have even reported feeling an overwhelming sense of being watched, as if Roy's ghost is silently guarding the place he once called home. Accounts of encounters with Roy vary, but most agree on his eerie stillness and immense presence. He rarely appears as a full apparition. Instead, his shadow is cast on walls or floors, elongated and distorted, sometimes lurking just beyond the edge of a flashlight's beam. On more than one occasion, people have felt the air shift around them, followed by a deep, dragging sound, the slow shuffle of heavy footsteps coming closer, then fading away into the silence. Rolling Hills is also known for its whisper-soft, almost unintelligible voices that seem to float through the air. Visitors have caught fragments of conversations, or hear their names called out faintly, as if the asylum's former inhabitants are trying to reach across time. Sometimes these whispers turn to anguished moans or cries, carrying the weight of decades of pain and loss. Those who spend time alone in the darker parts of the asylum often describe a feeling of dread so strong it's almost physical, a sensation that something unseen is watching, waiting. Several rooms are particularly notorious for their paranormal activity. One of these is the old morgue, a place where many of the asylum's dead were prepared before burial. The air there is said to grow cold and heavy, and some have reported seeing ghostly figures moving behind the cracked glass of the windows. Others claim to hear the rattling of chains or the distant clinking of surgical instruments, sounds that seem to echo from a time when death was a daily visitor. The asylum's basement, a labyrinth of cold, dark tunnels and storage rooms, has also become a hotspot for ghost hunters. Stories speak of shadowy figures darting in and out of sight, strange lights flickering without source, and unexplained footsteps that follow intruders as they explore the underground corridors. The oppressive atmosphere down there makes even the most skeptical question what lurks in the shadows. Visitors have also reported strange physical sensations, sudden chills, an inexplicable heaviness on their chest, or the feeling of being touched by invisible hands. Some claim to have been scratched or grabbed, though no visible cause could be found. These encounters are often accompanied by feelings of confusion, fear, and sadness, emotions thought to be echoes of the trauma experienced by those who lived and died within these walls. Rolling Hills Asylum closed its doors to patients many years ago, but its story has never truly ended. It remains a powerful symbol of a forgotten era when society's outcasts were hidden away rather than helped. The ghosts that haunt its halls are more than just spooky legends. They are echoes of lives lost, of suffering endured in silence and isolation. They remind us of the human cost of neglect and fear, and the deep scars left behind. For those who walk the grounds today, Rolling Hills offers more than just chilling tales and haunted stories. It serves as a somber reminder of compassion denied and the price paid by those who were forgotten. And as night falls over the asylum's broken windows and rusting gates, the voices of the past whisper still footsteps in the dark. Doors opening to nowhere, and the slow, heavy shuffle of Roy's shadow moving through the endless corridors of a place where time seems frozen, and the dead refuse to rest. Eloise Psychiatric Hospital in Westland, Michigan, stands as a haunting testament to a dark chapter in American mental health history. What started as a humble poorhouse in 1839 eventually grew into a sprawling complex of 78 buildings, sprawling over hundreds of acres. At one time, Eloise was a self-sufficient city, complete with its own post office, fire department, farm, and even a dairy. Yet, behind its self-contained facade, horror and suffering were woven into its very foundations. Originally designed to care for the poor and mentally ill, Eloise evolved over the decades into one of the largest psychiatric hospitals in the United States. Thousands passed through its gates, many arriving broken and forgotten by society. Families, unable or unwilling to care for their own, sent loved ones here hoping for treatment, but often finding only neglect. The asylum's population swelled to more than 10,000 at its peak, and resources became dangerously stretched. Inside Eloise, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Overcrowding was severe, with patients crammed into wards designed for far fewer occupants. Many endured harsh and experimental treatments, including electroshock therapy administered without anesthesia, insulin coma therapy, and lobotomies. These brutal procedures left many patients permanently disabled or dead. The staff, often undertrained and overwhelmed, struggled to maintain order, sometimes resorting to physical restraints and isolation cells. Disease was rampant. Tuberculosis, influenza, and other infections spread easily in the cramped, unsanitary quarters. Many patients died without receiving proper care, their bodies left unclaimed by families who often abandoned them. These forgotten souls were buried anonymously in a large potter's field on the hospital grounds. It is estimated that over 7,000 bodies rest in that field, names lost, identities erased, their lives reduced to cold statistics. By the mid-20th century, changes in psychiatric care and funding cuts led to the hospital's gradual decline. Buildings were shuttered or demolished, and the patient population steadily decreased. Today, only a handful of Eloise's original structures remain, mostly in ruins, standing as silent witnesses to the pain that unfolded within their walls. Despite the decay and abandonment, Eloise's spirit remains restless. Paranormal investigators flock to the site, drawn by stories of supernatural activity that seem as alive as the buildings themselves. Visitors report hearing disembodied voices, whispering unintelligible words, or calling out names long forgotten. Some have captured ghostly murmurs on electronic devices, voices that suddenly appear and disappear without explanation. Shadowy figures are commonly seen drifting through the crumbling halls. These apparitions often appear fleetingly, vanishing when approached or illuminated by a flashlight. Some describe seeing shapes that resemble former patients, small children, or elderly men and women moving silently between rooms or watching from dark corners. Others claim to have seen staff members from decades past, dressed in period uniforms, their faces etched with exhaustion and sorrow. One of the most chilling phenomena reported at Eloise is the sound of crying. Visitors walking through the ruins have heard the faint sobbing of a woman echoing through empty hallways. The sound is described as heart-wrenching, filled with despair and loneliness. Attempts to locate the source often prove futile, as the crying fades away, leaving only an oppressive silence in its wake. Footsteps following visitors are another common experience. People have reported hearing the unmistakable rhythm of someone walking just behind them, pacing their movements as if unseen eyes track every step. When they turn around, however, there is never anyone there, only empty corridors and broken walls. This sensation of being watched or followed can induce a deep sense of unease and vulnerability. Rooms that once held patients are hotspots for paranormal activity. In some wards, the temperature drops suddenly, a chilling cold that penetrates skin and bone. Doors swing open and shut without cause, and lights flicker or go out entirely. Visitors have felt invisible touches, a hand brushing against their shoulder, or a finger tracing their backs, sending shivers down their spines. The hospital's old operating rooms have their own dark reputation. These sterile chambers, where countless brutal procedures were performed, exude an atmosphere thick with sorrow and pain. Some who have entered report hearing the faint metallic clink of surgical instruments, or the distant echo of muffled screams. The lingering energy seems to speak of suffering that never found peace. The grounds themselves are not immune to the hauntings. The Potter S. Field, where thousands are buried, holds a heavy silence that can be felt physically by those who walk among the unmarked graves. At night, eerie lights and orbs have been spotted drifting above the earth, and the occasional whisper rides the wind, carrying the weight of forgotten stories. Eloise's haunting legacy extends beyond mere ghost stories. It stands as a stark reminder of the failures of a mental health system that once treated human beings as little more than cases or burdens. The asylum's ruins symbolize not only the suffering endured, but also the resilience of those forgotten, whose spirits refuse to be silenced. Today, efforts to preserve what remains of Eloise are ongoing, but the site remains fragile. Visitors who enter the grounds are urged to do so respectfully, mindful of the lives and memories that still linger there. For many, the experience is transformative, an encounter with history's darkest corners and the echoes of souls yearning to be remembered. In the end, Eloise Psychiatric Hospital is more than a collection of crumbling buildings or eerie tales. It is a testament to humanity's struggle with mental illness, the shadows cast by neglect, and the enduring power of memory. And as the wind whispers through the ruins, carrying faint voices and footsteps, one thing is clear: Eloise's ghosts have not moved on. They remain, watching, waiting, and reminding us that some places never truly let go. Penhurst State School and Hospital, located in Spring City, Pennsylvania, is a grim reminder of a dark era in the treatment of the mentally and physically disabled. Opening its doors in 1908, Penhurst was originally intended as a safe haven, a place where society's most vulnerable could receive care and support. Instead, it became a place marked by neglect, abuse, and unimaginable suffering. Over the decades, the walls of Penhurst absorbed the pain and despair of thousands, leaving behind an atmosphere thick with sorrow and restless spirits. At its peak, Penhurst housed more than 3,000 residents, many of whom were children. The institution was overcrowded and understaffed, with inadequate resources to properly care for the immense number of patients. Conditions inside deteriorated rapidly. Patients were often left chained or locked in isolation rooms for days or weeks on end. Food was scarce and of poor quality. Hygiene was neglected, and medical care was often cruel or experimental rather than compassionate. Abuse was rampant. Staff frequently used physical punishment to control patients, employing restraints, seclusion, and in some cases, torture-like methods. Patients suffered not only from the limitations of their disabilities, but from the fear and brutality inflicted by those meant to care for them. Numerous reports surfaced over the years detailing horrific acts: patients beaten for minor infractions, left to lie in their own waste, and subjected to humiliating and painful treatments. Among the most notorious abuses were the cruel experiments conducted under the guise of medical progress. Patients were subjected to electroshock therapy without anesthesia, forced into ice baths, and given unproven drugs with devastating side effects. Some were used in medical experiments that caused permanent damage or death. These procedures, carried out without consent, left physical and emotional scars that haunt the grounds to this day. Penhurst's reputation eventually caught the attention of the public, and in the 1970s and 1980s, investigations led to lawsuits and the eventual closure of the institution in 1987. But even after the doors shut, The legacy of suffering refused to fade. Today, the abandoned halls and decaying buildings of Pinehurst State School and Hospital stand as one of the most haunted sites in America. The sheer volume of pain, fear, and tragedy embedded in the site has created a hotspot for paranormal activity. Visitors and investigators alike report chilling phenomena that suggest the restless spirits of those who suffered there remain. One of the most common experiences reported is the sound of screams echoing through empty corridors. These screams, high-pitched and filled with terror, seem to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, reverberating off the crumbling walls. People who explore the halls after dark say the screams can suddenly stop, only to be replaced by an eerie silence that feels even more unsettling. Doors throughout the complex slam shut on their own, often with such force that the sound echoes through entire wings. Visitors have witnessed doors creaking open slowly as if pushed by unseen hands, then snapping shut again without any visible cause. These inexplicable movements create an atmosphere of tension and fear, as if the building itself is alive, watching, and reacting to intruders. Objects also move without explanation. Chairs are found knocked over, windows open and close, and small items shift position between visits. Some ghost hunters claim to have had their equipment tampered with, batteries draining suddenly or recorders turning off mid-session. These disturbances seem to intensify the longer visitors remain inside. One of the most terrifying aspects of Pinehurst's hauntings are the electronic voice phenomena, or EVPs, captured during investigations. Using specialized recording devices, ghost hunters have captured voices whispering urgent, desperate messages. Among the most chilling are phrases like "get out," "help me," and "why did you leave me?" These words seem to come from spirits trapped in endless suffering, reaching out to the living for acknowledgement or release. Sightings of apparitions are also frequently reported. Shadowy figures dart through hallways or stand silently at the end of a corridor, vanishing when approached. Some visitors have described seeing children in old-fashioned clothing, wandering the halls with vacant expressions, or playing silently before disappearing. Others speak of misty figures that appear and fade like ghosts caught between worlds. Certain rooms within Pinehurst are especially known for intense paranormal activity. The isolation cells, where patients were locked away for days at a time, emit an overwhelming sense of dread. Visitors report feeling sudden cold spots, oppressive energy, and the sensation of being watched or even touched. The padded rooms, once designed to protect patients from self-harm, are often described as suffocating and claustrophobic. Even in abandonment, the hospital's morgue is another area rife with eerie occurrences. The air here feels heavy and stagnant, and strange noises have been reported: soft footsteps, dragging sounds, and faint whispers. Investigators have caught unexplained shadows moving across the cracked walls, and some say the weight of death is palpable in this place. Outside the buildings, the grounds themselves seem to carry the sorrow of the thousands who lived and died there. At night, visitors have reported hearing footsteps crunching on gravel, only to find no one nearby. Faint voices sometimes drift on the wind, carrying the echoes of long-lost conversations or cries for help. Pinehurst's haunting legacy is more than ghost stories. It is a reminder of the dark history of institutional care in America. The suffering that took place here demands remembrance, not only for the sake of those who endured it, but as a warning against repeating the mistakes of the past. For many, visiting Pinehurst is a sobering experience, a confrontation with history, its darkest corners, and the ghosts that refuse to rest. The abandoned hospital stands as a monument to pain, neglect, and forgotten souls still calling out from the shadows. Despite its grim past, Pinehurst today is also a site of preservation and education. Efforts are underway to maintain what remains of the complex and to share its history with the public, ensuring that the stories of those who lived and died there are not lost to time. Yet, even as restoration progresses, the spirits linger. Those who walk the halls after dark know that Pinehurst's ghosts have not moved on. They remain, trapped by memories of cruelty and abandonment, their voices still echoing through the empty corridors, reminding all who listen that some places carry the weight of suffering forever. Letchworth Village in Rockland County, New York, opened its doors in 1911 with the promise of humane care for the mentally ill and physically disabled. At the time, it was hailed as a progressive institution designed with a spacious campus, fresh air, and the intention of providing a nurturing environment away from the overcrowded and inhumane conditions of city hospitals and poorhouses. Its sprawling grounds featured gardens, cottages, and recreational facilities, creating an appearance of hope and compassion. Yet beneath this idyllic facade, a darker reality took root, one of neglect, abuse, and chilling medical experimentation that left scars far deeper than the patient's visible disabilities. Initially, Letchworth Village operated with a mission of care and rehabilitation. The institution was planned as a self-sufficient community, complete with workshops, farms, and schools, where patients could learn skills, contribute to their upkeep, and live with some measure of dignity. Children, many abandoned by families unable or unwilling to care for them, were housed alongside adults, all under the watchful eyes of doctors, nurses, and attendants who were supposed to provide treatment and support. However, as the years passed, overcrowding became an unrelenting problem. The patient population swelled well beyond the institution's capacity, and resources became strained. Staff shortages meant many patients were left uncared for hours or days at a time. The idyllic environment gave way to crowded dormitories, unsanitary conditions, and an atmosphere thick with fear and despair. Others simply vanished into the shadows of the institution, their stories unheard and forgotten. One of the darkest chapters in Letchworth's history was its role in medical experimentations, some of it unethical and deeply disturbing by today's standards. The institution became a site for some of the earliest human trials of the polio vaccine, where children, many unable to consent or understand what was happening, were used as test subjects. These experiments, conducted in the 1940s and 1950s, often involved repeated injections and exposure to the virus without proper safeguards or parental permission. While the vaccine eventually became a global breakthrough, the cost to those vulnerable children at Letchworth was immense pain, suffering, and lasting trauma. Beyond the vaccine trials, patients at Letchworth were subjected to other cruel treatments. Restraints were common, used not just for dangerous behavior, but as a routine means of control. Physical abuse and neglect were widespread. Some patients were left without proper food, medical care, or hygiene. Isolation rooms and padded cells, meant to protect patients from harming themselves, became places of prolonged torment. The cries and screams of those confined often echoed through the halls, swallowed only by the thick stone walls. Many patients died within the institution's walls, their bodies buried in unmarked graves on the grounds or sent away without ceremony. Their deaths were rarely investigated, and families were often left uninformed. The anonymity of these lost lives adds to the lingering sense of sadness and injustice that haunts the site today. Though Letchworth Village officially closed its doors in the late 1990s, its legacy of suffering and silence remains palpable. Visitors to the site, now mostly abandoned and decaying, report a range of paranormal phenomena that seem to testify to the pain and neglect experienced by those who once lived there. Those who explore the grounds speak of an overwhelming sense of sorrow, a heavy atmosphere that presses down like a physical weight. Echoes of footsteps, slow and deliberate, are often heard in empty corridors. Doors creak open or slam shut without any apparent cause, and the faint sound of whispers seems to drift through the stale air. Some visitors have felt invisible touches or the sensation of being followed by unseen presences, as if the spirits of former residents are still wandering, lost and searching for peace. One of the most persistent legends is of children's laughter, echoing through the ruins, an eerie sound that contrasts sharply with the desolation around it. Yet those who hear it often feel a chill rather than comfort, as if the laughter masks a deeper, hidden sorrow. Shadowy figures, resembling children or adults, have been seen fleetingly in the corners of rooms or standing silently in the distance, disappearing when approached. The remnants of the hospital's buildings, the broken windows, crumbling walls, and rusted gates stand as silent witnesses to decades of pain and neglect. Some rooms still contain the scars of their past, peeling paint, scratched walls, and the faint outlines of where beds and restraints once stood. These physical traces serve as grim reminders that the suffering was not just a memory, but a lived reality. Paranormal investigators who have spent nights at Letchworth report capturing electronic voice phenomena, EVPs, ghostly voices on recordings that plead for help, call out names, or issue warnings like "don't come in" or "leave now." Others have recorded unexplained noises, footsteps pacing back and forth, chains rattling, or distant screams that seem to rise from the earth itself. These recordings only deepen the sense that Letchworth's past refuses to be forgotten. The history of Letchworth Village is more than just a story of haunted ruins. It is a cautionary tale about the dangers of neglecting society's most vulnerable. The institution's transformation from a hopeful sanctuary to a place of horror reflects broader failures in mental health care and social responsibility throughout the 20th century. The patients who lived, suffered, and died at Letchworth deserve to be remembered, not just as ghosts, but as human beings whose dignity was too often denied. Today, efforts are underway to preserve parts of the site and to educate the public about its history. Documentaries, books, and tours aim to shed light on what happened there, ensuring that the stories of Letchworth's residents are not lost to time. Yet for those who walk its empty halls, the presence of the past is unmistakable. The building's shadows seem to stretch beyond the decay, carrying with them the echoes of lives lived in pain, resilience, and hope. In the end, Letchworth Village stands as a haunting reminder that behind every institution lies a human story. Its legacy challenges us to confront the mistakes of the past and to strive for a future where care, compassion, and respect are never sacrificed. And as the wind stirs through the broken windows and empty corridors, the voices of those who once called Letchworth home whisper on, reminding us all that some places never truly let go. Linda Vista Community Hospital in Los Angeles, California, began its life in 1904 as a beacon of Hooper Hospital, built to care for the workers of the Santa Fe Railway. At the time, it represented progress and compassion, offering modern medical care to those who risked their lives building and maintaining the vital rail lines that connected the West to the rest of the country. Its elegant mission revival architecture, with white stucco walls and red-tilled roofs, stood as a proud symbol of stability in a rapidly changing city. But as the decades passed, the hospital's story turned darker, eventually earning Linda Vista a reputation as one of the most haunted places in California. In its early years, the hospital operated primarily for railway employees and their families. But over time, it expanded its services to the public. As Los Angeles grew, so did Linda Vista, becoming a community hospital for the Boyle Heights neighborhood. By the mid-20th century, however, the hospital's patient base had shifted dramatically. It became known for treating the poor and uninsured, those who had nowhere else to turn. This meant the hospital was often underfunded, overcrowded, and understaffed, struggling to provide even the most basic care. Medical equipment aged, rooms fell into disrepair, and the once proud hospital began to reflect the economic hardship of the area around it. By the 1970s and 1980s, Los Angeles was gripped by rising crime and gang violence, and Linda Vista became a frontline battleground in the fight to save lives. The emergency room was overwhelmed with victims of shootings, stabbings, and violent assaults. The hospital became notorious for the sheer number of deaths that occurred within its walls. Many patients arrived in critical condition, and despite the efforts of the staff, countless lives slipped away before they could even be prepped for surgery. Gunshot victims were rushed in on gurneys, their blood staining the tile floors, their final breaths exhaled under the harsh fluorescent lights of the trauma bays. The atmosphere inside the hospital grew heavy with despair. Nurses whispered of entire nights where death seemed to linger in the air, when every attempt to save a life ended in failure. Some believed the hospital was cursed, its halls saturated with sorrow and violence. Patients died alone, bodies stored in the basement morgue until they could be claimed or forgotten. Many were never claimed at all. By the early 1990s, Linda Vista could no longer sustain itself. Financial difficulties, combined with its declining reputation, sealed its fate. The hospital closed its doors in 1991, leaving behind a building frozen in Tima Place, where tragedy had etched itself into every wall, every cracked tile, every silent corridor. Though the patients and staff departed, something else remained. Today, Linda Vista Community Hospital is infamous for its paranormal activity. The empty halls echo with sounds that have no earthly explanation. Visitors and paranormal investigators report the unmistakable feeling of being watched, as if unseen eyes track their every move. Some describe the oppressive sensation of sadness that seems to seep from the walls themselves, a lingering residue of decades of suffering and sudden death. One of the most commonly reported phenomena at Linda Vista is the sound of footsteps echoing down the long, deserted hallways. They often follow visitors, matching their pace, only to stop abruptly when someone turns around. Disembodied voices have also been captured on recordings, whispers, groans, and even cries for help. Investigators claim to have heard urgent pleas like "Dante, leave me," or "help," as if the spirits of those who died too soon are still trapped, desperate for someone to save them. The operating rooms are particularly active. These cold, sterile spaces once served as the backdrop for frantic, life-or-death surgeries. Now they are eerily still, but many say the energy there is palpable. People have reported hearing the metallic clink of surgical instruments, the faint squeak of gurney wheels, or the soft hum of machinery long since dismantled. Some visitors feel sudden chills, as if an unseen presence brushes past, while others claim to see fleeting shadows dart across the room. The old maternity ward holds its own ghostly legends. Visitors have heard the faint cries of newborns echoing through the empty hallways, even though no babies have been delivered there in decades. Some investigators believe these sounds are residual hauntings, imprints of moments from the hospital's past that continue to replay like a broken record. Perhaps the most unnerving reports come from the basement, where the morgue still stands as a grim reminder of Linda Vista's darkest days. Here, bodies were stored in refrigerated drawers until they could be claimed. Many never were. Today, the morgue is a hotspot for paranormal activity. Visitors report feeling overwhelming dread, hearing the creak of doors opening on their own, and even seeing shadowy figures lurking near the old storage units. Some have described an intense, suffocating cold that settles over the room, making it hard to breathe. Apparitions are frequently reported throughout the hospital. Some claim to see a woman in a white nurse's uniform, her face expressionless as she drifts silently down the hallways. Others describe a man in hospital scrubs appearing in doorways before vanishing into thin air. There are also sightings of patients' figures in hospital gowns wandering aimlessly, their heads bowed, as if searching for something they never found in life. Today, the building still stands, though its windows are shattered and its walls bear the marks of time and decay. It has become a popular location for ghost hunters and film crews, appearing in horror movies and television shows. But those who step inside Linda Vista know that the real horror isn't scripted it. Embedded in the building's very foundation. The sorrow, the pain, the desperation of countless lives lost have left an indelible mark, one that no amount of time can erase. As night falls over the empty hospital, the echoes of its tragic past awaken. Footsteps reverberate in empty corridors. Voices whisper from the shadows. And in the silence between, you can almost hear the last desperate heartbeats of those who entered Linda Vista in search of life, but left as spirits, forever haunting the place they could never escape. Danvers State Hospital in Massachusetts is one of the most infamous psychiatric institutions in American history, a place whose name has become synonymous with suffering and the darkest practices in mental health care. Built in 1878 on a hill overlooking the town of Danvers, The imposing Gothic structure was intended to embody hope and progress for the treatment of mental illness. Its design followed the Kirkbride plan, an architectural style that emphasized light, air, and a sense of tranquility. At its inception, the hospital promised humane care for those society had cast aside. But what began as a vision of compassion eventually spiraled into a nightmare of neglect, abuse, and controversial medical practices that earned Danvers a chilling reputation as the birthplace of the lobotomy. When it first opened, Danvers State Hospital was built to accommodate about 500 patients. It was spacious, well ventilated, and surrounded by landscaped grounds meant to promote recovery. The treatment philosophy focused on moral therapy, using kindness, structured routines, and meaningful work to rehabilitate patients. For a time, it seemed to live up to its promise. Patients worked on the hospital farm, produced goods, and engaged in activities designed to restore dignity and purpose. But this period of optimism did not last. As the decades rolled on, the state's mental health system buckled under the strain of a growing population, and Danvers became a dumping ground for the mentally ill, the elderly, and the unwanted. By the 1930s and 1940s, the hospital was operating at more than 4 times its intended capacity, housing over 2,000 patients in conditions that can only be described as inhumane. The wards, once spacious and orderly, were now overcrowded and chaotic. Patients slept in hallways, day rooms, and any available space. Hygiene deteriorated, and the stench of unwashed bodies and illness permeated the air. The staff was overwhelmed and undertrained, resorting to harsh measures to maintain control. Restraints were used liberally, with patients tied to their beds or confined in isolation rooms for days or weeks at a time. As resources dwindled and pressure mounted to control the ever-growing patient population, Danvers became a breeding ground for experimental and extreme treatments. Among these were electroconvulsive therapy, ECT, insulin shock therapy, and the most controversial of all, the prefrontal lobotomy. Danvers earned its notorious reputation as the birthplace of the lobotomy, largely because of the pioneering and later mass application of this procedure within its walls. Initially hailed as a groundbreaking treatment for severe mental illness, the lobotomy involves severing connections in the brain's frontal lobes, permanently altering behavior and personality. At Danvers, these procedures were often performed in assembly line fashion, with little regard for the individual's well-being or consent. The results were devastating. Many patients were left with profound cognitive impairments, reduced to childlike dependency, or rendered completely catatonic. Others died from complications. The promise of a cure quickly gave way to grim reality, but the practice continued for years, driven by desperation and a lack of alternatives. The scars of these surgeries, both physical and emotional, lingered long after the instruments were put away. Conditions inside the hospital became so appalling that they eventually attracted public scrutiny. Investigations revealed rampant neglect, abuse, and a level of overcrowding that defied imagination. Patients wandered the halls aimlessly, many half-naked, others rocking in corners, their eyes vacant and hollow. Reports spoke of unsanitary conditions, inadequate food, and a pervasive atmosphere of hopelessness. Danvers, once envisioned as a sanctuary, had become a warehouse of human misery. The 1960s brought the beginning of the end, with the rise of new psychiatric medications and the deinstitutionalization movement. Large state hospitals across the country began to close. Danvers was no exception. The patient population dwindled, and entire wings were abandoned, leaving behind silent corridors and empty rooms that still seemed to echo with the suffering of decades past. By 1992, the hospital officially closed its doors, sealing its legacy as one of the most haunted and tragic landmarks in the nation's mental health history. Today, the remnants of Danvers State Hospital draw ghost hunters, urban explorers, and thrill seekers who are captivated by its eerie reputation. Stories of paranormal activity abound. Visitors report hearing disembodied voices whispering in the darkness, echoing down the long, decaying hallways. Doors slam shut without warning, and the sound of footsteps follows intruders through the ruins. only to vanish when they turn to look. Cold spots are common, and many claim to feel an oppressive presence watching them from the shadows. Apparitions have been sighted throughout the grounds, figures in tattered hospital gowns, drifting silently across rooms or standing motionless in corners. Some investigators speak of a tall, shadowy entity that roams the upper floors, while others describe glimpses of former patients replaying fragments of their lives like a broken record. The lobotomy wards are said to be the most active, haunted by those who endured the brutal procedure and never recovered. Visitors have reported sudden headaches, nausea, and overwhelming waves of sadness when entering these rooms, as if the anguish of the past still clings to the walls. EVPs captured during investigations have recorded chilling messages, soft murmurs pleading "don't hurt me," anguished cries, and even a cold, commanding voice ordering "get out." The morgue, where countless bodies once passed through, is another hotspot for unexplained phenomena. From flickering lights to the metallic clatter of instruments that no longer exist. Though parts of Danvers have been redeveloped into apartments, its dark history lingers like a stain that cannot be erased. For many, the site remains a symbol of the failures and horrors of early mental health care, a place where hope was twisted into despair. Danvers State Hospital stands as both a historical landmark and a haunted monument, a chilling reminder of how thin the line can be between healing and harm, and how the echoes of suffering can outlive even the strongest walls. Creedmoor Psychiatric Center in Queens, New York, began its life in 1912 as part of a growing network of mental health institutions designed to care for the city's mentally ill. Situated on sprawling grounds, Creedmoor was envisioned as a place of healing and recovery, where patients could receive treatment away from the pressures and chaos of urban life. At first, the facility operated on a modest scale, housing a few hundred patients in a handful of buildings. But as the decades passed, the institution expanded dramatically, so much so that by the mid-20th century, Creedmoor had become one of the largest psychiatric facilities in the country, with over 7,000 patients crammed into its wards. For a time, Creedmoor seemed to offer a refuge for those struggling with mental illness. But the reality behind its brick walls was far from the ideal. As the patient population ballooned, conditions inside deteriorated. Overcrowding was severe. Dormitories designed for a few dozen patients were packed with hundreds, and privacy became non-existent. Resources were stretched thin, and the staff, overwhelmed and undertrained, struggled to maintain even the most basic standards of care. Patients languished for years, sometimes decades, without adequate treatment, locked away from the outside world, and largely forgotten. The treatments administered at Creedmoor reflected the era's limited understanding of mental health. Harsh and often dangerous methods were routine. Electroconvulsive therapy, then seen as a miracle cure, was applied with alarming frequency and little concern for patient consent or well-being. Insulin shock therapy was another common practice, in which patients were induced into comas to reset their mental state. These procedures were risky and often left patients physically and emotionally scarred. Lobotomies, once hailed as a groundbreaking intervention, were also performed at Creedmoor, stripping individuals of their autonomy and reducing many to a vegetative state. Isolation rooms became a common punishment, where individuals could be confined for hours or days in stark, padded cells. Reports of abuse and neglect began to surface as the decades wore on. Stories circulated of patients wandering naked in the halls, untreated wounds festering. The very place that had been built as a sanctuary had turned into a warehouse of suffering. By the 1960s and 1970s, the tide began to turn. The deinstitutionalization movement swept across the United States, fueled by the advent of psychiatric medications and a growing recognition of patients' rights. Large mental health facilities like Creedmoor came under fire for their inhumane conditions and outdated practices. As patients were discharged in massive numbers, many without proper community support, Creedmoor's once bustling complex began to empty. Buildings that had housed thousands fell silent, their windows shattered and walls crumbling, as the institution faded into partial abandonment. Today, Creedmoor Psychiatric Center still operates on a smaller scale. But many of its original structures stand vacant, slowly decaying. These abandoned buildings have become a magnet for urban explorers, photographers, and paranormal investigators drawn to their eerie, desolate beauty and the stories that linger in the silence. Those who venture into the abandoned wings often describe an oppressive atmosphere, a heavy stillness that seems to hum with residual energy from decades of anguish. Long, dark corridors stretch into shadow, their walls peeling and floors littered with debris. Rusted bed frames and broken wheelchairs lie scattered like remnants of a forgotten era. Graffiti marks the walls now, but beneath the layers of paint and decay, the ghosts of Creedmoor's past seem ever present. Paranormal activity is frequently reported within these derelict spaces. Visitors claim to hear footsteps echoing down empty hallways, matching their own before stopping abruptly. Others describe faint voices, whispers too soft to make out, urgent but distant, as though carried on a breeze that doesn't exist. Some have even heard anguished cries reverberating through the still air, chilling reminders of the torment that once filled these rooms. Shadow figures are another common phenomenon. Dark silhouettes appear in doorways or flit across hallways, vanishing when approached. Investigators equipped with cameras and recording devices have captured unexplained anomalies. Orbs of light, sudden temperature drops, and electronic voice phenomena, EVPs, featuring disembodied pleas like Dan Tea Leave or Help Me. These recordings deepen the sense that Creedmoor is more than just a relic. It is a place where echoes of the past linger, restless and unresolved. One of the most unsettling areas is the old children's ward, where some of Creedmoor's youngest patients once lived. Visitors report the sound of faint laughter or the rolling of toy wheels on the floor, even though the rooms are barren. The juxtaposition of these innocent sounds against the stark decay is profoundly disturbing, as if the building itself mourns the childhoods lost within its walls. The morgue, located in one of the older buildings, is another hotspot for supernatural activity. Here, countless bodies pass through on their way to burial, many of them patients who died alone, their names forgotten, their graves unmarked. Those who enter the morgue often speak of an intense feeling of dread, as if the weight of countless tragedies presses down on anyone who crosses the threshold. Cold spots appear without explanation, and some claim to feel unseen hands brushing against their skin. Though much of Creedmoor lies in ruin, its story remains a sobering reminder of a time when mental illness was met with fear, misunderstanding, and institutional neglect. It stands as both a historical landmark and a haunted monument to the lives that were confined, mistreated, and often lost within its walls. Efforts have been made to repurpose parts of the property, but the abandoned structures resist erasure, holding fast to their secrets. For those who explore Creedmoor today, the experience is more than a simple thrill. It is an encounter with historia, confrontation with the suffering that unfolded behind locked doors and barred windows. The voices of the past still whisper through the corridors, a chilling testament to the human cost of a system that failed those it was meant to protect. And as the sun sets over the sprawling, decaying campus, the shadows deepen, and the silence comes alive, carrying the echoes of lives that never truly left. Norwich State Hospital, located in Preston, Connecticut, opened its doors in 1904 as part of a movement to provide care for those suffering from mental illness. At the time, the sprawling institution represented progress and hope, designed to remove patients from overcrowded city hospitals and place them in a serene, rural setting. The campus grew rapidly, eventually encompassing over 900 acres and dozens of buildings, interconnected by a network of tunnels. For decades, thousands of patients lived and died within its walls. But like so many asylums of its era, Norwich's promise of compassion soon gave way to neglect, abuse, and unimaginable suffering. In its early years, Norwich was considered a state-of-the-art facility, boasting open spaces, gardens, and recreational areas intended to promote recovery. The treatment philosophy focused on moral therapy, structured routines, fresh air, and meaningful work. However, as patient populations soared, this idealistic vision became impossible to maintain. By the mid-20th century, the hospital was severely overcrowded, housing far more individuals than it was designed to hold. Staff members were overworked and often undertrained, leaving patients in a perpetual state of neglect. Reports from former employees and surviving records paint a grim picture of life inside Norwich during its darkest days. Patients endured harsh and often inhumane treatments that were considered standard practice at the time. Electroconvulsive therapy was administered without anesthesia, causing violent seizures that left patients terrified and disoriented. Insulin shock therapy and hydrotherapies, immerging patients in scalding or icy water for hours, were common, as were heavy doses of sedatives. Lobotomies, the controversial surgical procedure that severs connections in the brain's frontal lobe, were also performed on patients who were deemed beyond help. These operations left many permanently incapacitated or worse. Physical restraints were another tool frequently used to maintain order. Some patients were bound to their beds for days at a time, while others were confined to isolation rooms for weeks. Those who resisted or acted out often faced brutal punishments. Sanitation was poor, disease spread quickly, and the air was thick with the stench of unwashed bodies and despair. In many cases, individuals were admitted to Norwich and never left. Families abandoned their relatives there, and over the decades, countless patients died nameless, buried in unmarked graves on the hospital grounds. By the 1970s, public awareness of these conditions, combined with the rise of psychiatric medications and the deinstitutionalization movement, began to seal Norwich's fate. Slowly, patients were discharged, and buildings were abandoned. In 1996, after more than 90 years of operation, Norwich State Hospital officially closed its doors, leaving behind a sprawling complex of empty wards, crumbling walls, and a legacy of misery. But while the patients and staff left, something else remained, a lingering energy that many believe is not entirely of this world. Almost immediately after its closure, Norwich gained a reputation as one of the most haunted places in New England. Urban explorers, ghost hunters, and thrill seekers flocked to the decaying campus, drawn by chilling tales of paranormal activity. They were not disappointed. Visitors report hearing screams echoing through the darkened hallways. Late at night, anguished cries that seemed to rise from nowhere and fade into silence just as quickly. Whispers drift through the air, carrying fragments of words, sometimes so close they feel like breath against the skin. The sound of doors slamming shut reverberates through empty corridors. Even though the windows are shattered and the buildings long abandoned, electronic voice phenomena, or EVPs, captured at Norwich, have sent chills down the spines of even the most seasoned investigators. Voices, recorded in the darkness, plead for help, cry out names, and issue warnings like "don't go" or "stay away." One of the most infamous EVPs ever captured there came during an investigation in the early 2000s. As the team stood in one of the old patient wards, their recorder picked up a clear, anguished voice, whispering two words: "Help us." No one in the group had spoken at that moment. The recording remains one of the most compelling pieces of evidence tied to Norwich. The activity isn't limited to sounds. Shadow figures have been reported darting across doorways or lingering in the corners of rooms before vanishing. Some visitors claim to have seen full-bodied apparitions, men and women in hospital gowns, faces gaunt and hollow, silently watching. Others describe an oppressive feeling of being followed or touched by unseen hands. Cold spots appear suddenly, and some explorers have felt their hair tugged or their clothing pulled without explanation. The tunnels beneath the hospital, which once transported staff and supplies between buildings, are notorious for paranormal encounters. These underground passages are pitch black and suffocatingly claustrophobic, with peeling paint and rusted pipes lining the walls. Those who venture down there often report hearing footsteps echoing behind them, growing louder and faster, only to turn and find nothing. Some have fled in terror after hearing guttural growls or the unmistakable sound of someone breathing heavily in the darkness. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Norwich's haunting is the overwhelming sense of sorrow that permeates the grounds. Investigators often speak of being suddenly overcome by waves of grief or despair. so intense they are brought to tears without understanding why. It is as if the building itself remembers the anguish of those who suffered within its walls and projects that emotion onto anyone who dares enter. Byberry Mental Hospital, officially known as the Philadelphia State Hospital, opened its doors in 1907 with the promise of providing care and treatment for the mentally ill. Located on the outskirts of Philadelphia, the sprawling complex was designed to be a sanctuary for those suffering from mental health issues, a place where they could receive compassionate treatment away from the chaos of city life. But what began as a vision of hope quickly descended into a nightmare. Byberry would become one of the most notorious psychiatric institutions in American history, a name forever linked to abuse, neglect, and unimaginable suffering. At first, the hospital followed the progressive ideals of the early 20th century, emphasizing moral treatment, structured routines, and fresh air. The campus was built with separate buildings for different categories of patients, connected by tunnels that allowed staff to move freely in all weather. However, as the decades passed, those lofty ideals collapsed under the weight of chronic overcrowding and systemic neglect. Designed to house a few hundred patients, Byberry eventually held more than 6,000 individuals at its peak. With staff stretched thin and funding inadequate, the institution devolved into chaos. The conditions inside Byberry were horrifying. Patients were left to wander the filthy halls naked, untreated, and often covered in their own waste. Sanitation was almost non-existent. The stench of urine and feces permeated the air, and vermin infested the wards. Basic medical care was frequently withheld, and mental health treatment was primitive at best. Many patients were simply warehoused and forgotten, their lives reduced to mere survival in a place that seemed designed to strip them of dignity. Reports of abuse were rampant. Patients were routinely beaten by attendants, some of whom treated their charges with unimaginable cruelty. Others were chained to their beds for days, weeks, or even years at a time. Isolation rooms, bare, cold, and often without bedding, were used as punishment, where patients could be left alone for extended periods. The screams of those locked away echoed through the corridors, a constant reminder of the suffering that lurked behind closed doors. Electroconvulsive therapy was administered frequently and often without anesthesia, leaving patients terrified and broken. Lobotomies, hailed as a miracle cure in the mid-20th century, were performed on countless individuals, reducing many to a vegetative state. These procedures were carried out with little oversight, and patient consent was rarely considered. Hydrotherapy, another common practice, involved forcing patients into scalding or icy baths for hours at a time, sometimes resulting in severe injury or death. In many cases, patients admitted for minor conditions, such as depression or anxiety, found themselves trapped in a living hell, with no hope of release. By the 1940s, Byberry had become so infamous that journalists and investigators began to expose its horrors. In 1946, a series of shocking photographs taken by an investigative journalist revealed the truth to the public. The images showed patients huddled naked in filthy wards, lying on the floor amid human waste. These photographs ignited a national outcry and brought intense scrutiny to mental health institutions across the country. But despite public outrage, conditions at Byberry remained deplorable for decades. The hospital's reputation only worsened as the years passed. Overcrowding continued, and violence among patients and staff escalated. Suicides and unexplained deaths were common, yet rarely investigated. In some cases, patients simply vanished, their fates unknown. For many families, Byberry became a place where loved ones disappeared into the shadows, never to return. The deinstitutionalization movement of the 1960s and 1970s began to empty large psychiatric hospitals across the nation, and Byberry was no exception. Patients were released into community programs, many of which were ill-equipped to handle their needs. Yet, even as the population declined, the facility's problems persisted. Neglect and abuse continued until the very end. Finally, in 1990, after decades of scandal and mounting pressure from advocacy groups, Byberry closed its doors for good. But its story didn't end there. After its closure, the abandoned hospital became a magnet for urban explorers, thrill seekers, and paranormal investigators. What they found inside only deepened Byberry's dark legend. The decaying buildings, filled with rusted bed frames, broken restraints, and yellowing patient records, seemed frozen in time. Graffiti covered the walls, but beneath the vandalism lay a palpable sense of despair. Many who entered the crumbling complex spoke of an oppressive atmosphere, as if the suffering that once consumed Byberry had seeped into its very foundations. Reports of paranormal activity soon followed. Visitors claimed to hear whispers echoing down empty corridors, disembodied voices calling out names, and blood-curdling screams erupting from rooms long abandoned. Doors slammed shut on their own, and footsteps paced the halls when no one was there. Shadowy figures were seen darting across doorways or standing silently in the distance before vanishing without a trace. Some explorers reported feeling sudden chills or the sensation of being touched by unseen hands. Others fled in terror after hearing the metallic rattle of chains dragging across the floor. Ghostly remnants of the patients who had once been shackled there. Electronic voice phenomena, EVPs captured within Byberry, have yielded chilling results. Investigators have recorded voices whispering, "Don't leave, help me, and why?" These eerie messages, coupled with the building's violent past, have cemented its status as one of the most haunted locations in Pennsylvania. Today, the physical remnants of Byberry are mostly gone. The buildings have been demolished and the land redeveloped. Yet the legacy of what happened there endures. For many, Byberry is more than just a ghost story. It is a stark reminder of the failures of an era when society turned a blind eye to the suffering of its most vulnerable. Thousands of lives were shattered behind its walls, and countless souls remain unaccounted for. Some believe those souls still linger, restless and searching for justice. Their cries carried on the wind that sweeps across the ground where Byberry once stood. Fairfield Hills State Hospital, located in Newtown, Connecticut, opened its doors in 1931 during an era when massive psychiatric institutions were seen as the best solution for treating the mentally ill. Built on nearly 800 acres of rolling countryside, the hospital was designed to be self-sufficient, with its own farm, power plant, and workshops. The complex included grand brick buildings connected by a vast network of underground tunnels, meant to facilitate movement during harsh winters. At its peak, Fairfield Hills housed thousands of patients and employed hundreds of staff members, creating what was essentially a small city within the quiet Connecticut countryside. At first glance, Fairfield Hills appeared progressive and humane. Patients were given work assignments and recreational activities, and the serene setting was believed to aid in recovery. But as the decades wore on, the reality behind those walls grew increasingly grim. Overcrowding became a severe issue as the patient population swelled far beyond the hospital's intended capacity. Dormitories and wards were packed with men and women who had nowhere else to go. Many were abandoned by their families and left to live out their lives in isolation. The treatments offered at Fairfield Hills reflected the limited understanding of mental illness at the time. Electroconvulsive therapy, or shock therapy, was widely used and often performed without anesthesia, leaving patients traumatized and physically exhausted. Insulin coma therapy, a procedure where patients were injected with massive doses of insulin to induce seizures, was another common practice. But perhaps the most infamous treatment carried out within the hospital's walls was the lobotomy. During the 1940s and 1950s, lobotomies were hailed as a miracle cure for severe mental disorders, and Fairfield Hills became one of the institutions that embraced this controversial procedure. Surgeons would insert sharp instruments through the patient's eye socket or skull to sever connections in the brain's frontal lobes. The results were devastating. Many patients were left with severe cognitive impairment, reduced to a childlike state, while others died from complications. The once hopeful promise of treatment gave way to a factory-like system of experimentation, stripping patients of their identities and humanity. By the 1960s and 1970s, public awareness of the horrors occurring inside psychiatric hospitals began to grow. The deinstitutionalization movement combined with the introduction of psychiatric medications, led to a dramatic decline in patient populations. Like many state hospitals, Fairfield Hills struggled to justify its existence. Entire wards were abandoned as patients were released or transferred to community-based programs. In 1995, after more than 6 decades of operation, Fairfield Hills State Hospital officially closed its doors, leaving behind a sprawling campus of empty buildings and dark tunnels, a haunting reminder of an era marked by both hope and tragedy. In the years since its closure, Fairfield Hills has gained a reputation as one of the most haunted locations in New England. The abandoned hospital attracts urban explorers, ghost hunters, and thrill seekers, all drawn by stories of paranormal activity that seem to seep from its decaying walls. The atmosphere inside the old buildings is oppressive. Peeling paint hangs from the ceilings. Rusted gurneys sit forgotten in corners, and faded patient records lie scattered across the floors. The silence is broken only by the creak of aging beams and the distant drip of water echoing through the tunnels. Those who dare to enter report chilling encounters that defy explanation. Disembodied voices whisper through the halls, their words indistinct but urgent, like fragments of conversations frozen in time. Doors slam shut without warning, even when there is no breeze. Some explorers claim to have heard the echoing clang of metal, as if old gurneys or stretchers were being wheeled through the corridors by unseen hands. Others speak of laughter, soft, eerie giggles that drift down empty hallways, only to fade into silence when approached. Electronic voice phenomena, EVPs captured at Fairfield Hills, have produced some of the most disturbing evidence of all. Investigators have recorded voices saying chilling phrases such as "stay with us," "don't go," and "help me." These ghostly pleas suggest a lingering presence, as if the souls of former patients remain trapped, bound to the place where they suffered and died. Some recordings have even captured what sounds like screams echoing faintly in the distance, raising questions about whether the hospital's dark history has left an imprint that refuses to fade. The underground tunnel system is particularly notorious for paranormal activity. These tunnels, which once transported patients, staff, and supplies between buildings, are pitch black and suffocatingly silent. Explorers venturing below ground often describe feeling an overwhelming sense of dread, as though something unseen is watching from the shadows. Footsteps echo in the darkness, growing louder and closer, only to vanish when the light of a flashlight swings toward the sound. One investigator reported hearing a low, guttural growl reverberating through the tunnel, so chilling that he fled the building in terror. Apparitions are another common phenomenon at Fairfield Hills. Shadowy figures are seen gliding across doorways or lingering at the far end of corridors, dissolving into thin air when approached. Some witnesses have reported full-bodied apparitions dressed in hospital gowns, their faces pale and hollow, standing silently before disappearing. Perhaps the most famous account came from an urban explorer who swore he saw a man in a tattered hospital gown staring at him from the end of a hallway. When he took a step forward, the figure dissolved like mist, leaving nothing but the oppressive silence of the abandoned ward. Today, portions of the Fairfield Hills campus have been redeveloped for municipal use, but many of the original buildings remain boarded up, their windows shattered, and their walls covered in ivy. The town has attempted to preserve some structures for historical purposes, but no amount of redevelopment can erase the aura of darkness that clings to this place, for those who have walked its halls or ventured into its tunnels. Fairfield Hills is more than an abandoned hospital. It is a monument to forgotten lives, lost hope, and lingering spirits that refuse to let go. The Athens Lunatic Asylum, later known as the Ridges, opened in 1874 as part of a nationwide movement to create massive psychiatric hospitals in serene rural settings. Perched on a hill overlooking Athens, Ohio, the asylum was designed in the Kirkbride style, with sprawling red brick wings meant to maximize sunlight and fresh air. At its inception, the facility was considered progressive, promising a safe haven for those suffering from mental illness. But as the years passed, that promise unraveled, and the Ridges became infamous for inhumane treatments, overcrowding, and neglect. Today, Long after its closure, the building is remembered not for its beauty or innovation, but for the darkness that still lingers within its walls. Initially, the asylum adopted the moral treatment philosophy, emphasizing structured routines, work, therapy, and wholesome environments to restore mental health. Patients tended gardens, worked in workshops, and walked the tree-lined grounds. But as the hospital's reputation grew, so did its population. By the early 1900s, the Ridges was overcrowded, housing far more patients than it was designed for. Wards meant for a handful of individuals were crammed with dozens. Privacy disappeared, conditions deteriorated, and the focus shifted from care to control. Treatments during this era were often cruel and experimental. Hydrotherapies, immerging patients in freezing or scalding water, was routine, believed to calm agitation. Electroconvulsive therapy was performed without anesthesia, leaving patients terrified and traumatized. The most infamous practice, however, was the lobotomy. During the 1940s and 1950s, the asylum embraced this controversial procedure, which involved severing connections in the brain's frontal lobes. It was touted as a miracle cure for severe mental illness, but in reality, it left many patients incapacitated, childlike, or dead. As the decades passed, countless individuals died within the asylum's walls. Some from illness or failed treatments, others from neglect or suicide. Many were buried in the hospital cemetery, their graves marked only by numbers, their names lost to history. By the 1970s, growing awareness of these conditions and the rise of psychiatric medications fueled a nationwide push for deinstitutionalization. Patients were discharged, buildings were abandoned, and in 1993, after 119 years of operation, the Ridges closed its doors. But its story didn't end there. The empty halls of the Ridges became a magnet for ghost hunters, urban explorers, and thrill seekers, drawn by tales of paranormal activity. What they found and continued to find suggests that the asylum's past still lingers in ways that defy explanation. Among the many ghost stories tied to the Ridges, one stands out as its most chilling: the legend of the stain. In December 1978, a patient named Margaret Schilling vanished. For weeks, staff searched the grounds but found no trace of her. It wasn't until January, more than a month later, that her body was discovered in an abandoned ward on the upper floors of the main building. She had died alone, locked inside the room. By then, decomposition had set in so deeply that fluids had seeped into the floor, leaving behind a dark, human-shaped stain. Despite repeated attempts to scrub it away, the stain refused to vanish. Even sanding the floor failed to erase it completely. Today, the stain remains an eerie silhouette that has become the asylum's most infamous feature. Visitors who stand over it often describe a wave of unease, as if the room itself is charged with sorrow. Some claim to hear faint whispers or feel an invisible presence watching them. Whether the stain is simply a physical remnant of Margaret's death or something more sinister is a question that haunts everyone who sees it. But the stain is only part of the Ridges' paranormal lore. The entire complex is said to be alive with activity. Explorers report hearing footsteps echoing through empty hallways, pacing steadily before fading into silence. Doors creak open and slam shut without warning. Lights flicker in buildings long disconnected from power. In some rooms, sudden cold spots chill the air, even in the heat of summer. Whispers are another common phenomenon: soft, indistinct voices that seem to drift from nowhere. Investigators have captured chilling electronic voice phenomena during overnight stays, including phrases like, "Don't go, stay, and help me." These voices often seem to respond to questions, as if unseen presences are desperate to communicate. Apparitions have also been reported throughout the complex. Shadowy figures glide silently down corridors or linger at the far ends of rooms, vanishing when approached. Some witnesses describe seeing patients in outdated hospital gowns, their expressions blank and lifeless. Others claim to have encountered former staff members, nurses, and doctors, who appear for an instant before dissolving into thin air. The surgical wing, where lobotomies were once performed, is particularly active. Those who enter often describe a suffocating sense of dread, as if the walls themselves remember the agony endured there. The tunnels beneath the ridges, which once transported patients and supplies between buildings, are notorious for their oppressive atmosphere, pitch black and eerily silent. They amplify every sound. A dripping pipe becomes a thunderclap. A distant shuffle echoes like an approaching figure. Explorers who brave these tunnels often report hearing footsteps following them, only to turn and find nothing but darkness. Some claim to have felt cold hands brush against their skin or tug at their clothing. Even the hospital cemetery, where more than 1,900 patients were buried, holds its own share of eerie encounters. The graves, many marked only by small numbered stones, are said to exude a mournful energy. Visitors report hearing disembodied voices and feeling sudden chills that no amount of sunlight can explain. Today, parts of the ridges have been repurposed by Ohio University, but many of its original buildings remain standing, their Gothic architecture casting long, sinister shadows across the grounds. The stain is still there, a permanent reminder of the asylum's darkest days. And with it, the stories of restless spirits who seem unwilling or unable to leave. Central State Hospital, Indianapolis, Indiana, once one of the largest psychiatric hospitals in the Midwest. Central State opened in 1848 and grew to house thousands. Reports of abuse, experiments, and deaths plagued its history. Today, the remaining buildings are haunted by more than memories. Paranormal investigators report hearing screams, laughter, and even voices calling their names. Shadow figures appear in doorways and vanish when approached. Some claim to feel hands grabbing their arms, only to turn and find no one there. Metropolitan State Hospital in Waltham, Massachusetts, stands as one of the most haunting reminders of the dark chapters in psychiatric care history. Established in 1930, it was initially built to alleviate overcrowding at the nearby Metropolitan State Hospital in Boston and to provide a modern facility for the mentally ill. Spanning nearly 400 acres, the hospital was a sprawling complex, boasting multiple buildings connected by a network of tunnels, designed to house thousands of patients. At first glance, it seemed like a place intended for healing and refuge. But beneath the surface, a far grimmer story unfolded, one marked by neglect, violence, and tragedy that would leave a lasting scar on its legacy. During its years of operation, Metropolitan State Hospital was home to thousands of patients suffering from a variety of mental illnesses. Many were brought here by families desperate for help, while others had nowhere else to go. The hospital's size and relative isolation allowed it to operate with little outside oversight, creating an environment where abuses could flourish unchecked. Like many psychiatric institutions of its time, treatments were often harsh and dehumanizing. Patients underwent electroconvulsive therapy administered without adequate anesthesia, were subjected to isolation, and at times received experimental medications with unknown side effects. The hospital's staff was overwhelmed by the sheer number of patients and often undertrained, leading to neglect and insufficient care. Conditions deteriorated over time, and reports of mistreatment and abuse became increasingly common. One of the most infamous events that sealed Metropolitan State Hospital's stark reputation occurred in the 1970s and gave rise to its chilling nickname, the Hospital of Seven Teeth. The story revolves around a brutal murder committed within the hospital walls, an incident that shocked staff, patients, and the local community alike. The victim was a fellow patient who, tragically, fell prey to a violent assault at the hands of another resident. What made the crime particularly gruesome was the perpetrator's disturbing practice of collecting his victim's teeth as trophies. He extracted 7 of them, keeping them as morbid souvenirs. This horrifying act was not only a testament to the violence that could erupt within the hospital's confines, but also a stark symbol of the facility's failure to protect its vulnerable population. The murder exposed glaring issues at Metropolitan State: insufficient security, staff shortages, and a system stretched too thin to adequately supervise thousands of patients. The incident sent ripples through the psychiatric community, and contributed to growing public awareness of the dire conditions many state hospitals faced across the country. Metropolitan State Hospital grappled with mounting pressure to reform and reduce patient numbers, in line with the national movement toward deinstitutionalization. Psychiatric medication advances allowed more patients to live outside hospital settings, and the government began shifting funds away from large institutions. Patient populations declined, and parts of the hospital fell into disrepair. In 1992, after decades of operation, Metropolitan State Hospital officially closed. While many of its buildings were demolished in subsequent years, some structures still stand silent and crumbling reminders of a troubled past. Even though the hospital has been closed for decades, the spirits of its history seem far from at rest. The grounds and remaining buildings have become a hotspot for paranormal investigators and urban explorers. Drawn by reports of ghostly activity and eerie occurrences, the hospital's dark history has fueled tales of restless souls trapped between worlds, unwilling to move on. Visitors to the site often recount strange experiences: disembodied voices whispering unintelligible words, sudden drops in temperature, and unexplained noises like footsteps or distant screams echoing through the empty halls. Doors reportedly open and close on their own, and objects sometimes move without cause. These phenomena are particularly intense in certain areas, especially in wards where violent incidents, like the 17th murder, took place. One of the most active sites is the former patients' cemetery, located on the hospital grounds. Hundreds of unclaimed patients were buried there over the years, many in unmarked graves. Visitors to the cemetery often speak of feeling an unnatural chill and hearing faint voices carried by the wind, even on warm days. Some have claimed to see shadowy figures moving between the headstones, or to hear whispered names calling out from the darkness. Paranormal investigators, equipped with recording devices, have captured chilling electronic voice phenomena, EVPs, on the hospital grounds. Phrases like "Help me," "Why are you here?" and "Leave now" have been picked up during late-night sessions, further feeding the belief that the spirits of former patients linger, bound to the place by suffering and unrest. The tunnels beneath the hospital, once used to discreetly transport patients and supplies, are another source of paranormal reports. These narrow, claustrophobic passageways seem to amplify the eerie sensations experienced above. Many who have explored these tunnels speak of sudden feelings of dread, footsteps that don't belong to anyone present, and the unsettling sensation of being watched. Metropolitan State Hospital's legacy is a haunting reminder of a time when mental illness was stigmatized and often met with fear, misunderstanding, and cruelty. The stories of neglect, violence, and tragedy that occurred within its walls serve as a somber reflection on the importance of compassionate, humane care for those suffering from mental health issues. The Hospital of 17th nickname, born from one of its darkest moments, symbolizes the hospital's grim past, but also acts as a warning. It stands as a testament to the lives lost and the pain endured by those who passed through its gates, many forgotten by the world outside. Today, as the remnants of Metropolitan State Hospital decay and nature slowly reclaims the land, the echoes of its troubled history remain for those brave enough to walk its grounds. The presence of the past is palpable, a chilling reminder that some wounds and some souls never fully heal. Taunton State Hospital, located in Taunton, Massachusetts, opened its doors in 1854 with a mission that was progressive for its time: to provide compassionate care and treatment for the mentally ill. It was built during an era when the moral treatment movement was gaining ground, a philosophy that emphasized kindness, structure, and fresh air as cures for mental illness. The hospital's sprawling grounds, red brick buildings, and manicured gardens painted a picture of hope and healing. However, beneath this facade of benevolence, a much darker history would unfold over the decades. One steeped in tragedy, neglect, and whispered horrors. At its inception, Taunton State Hospital was designed to hold just a few hundred patients. The building was intended to be a sanctuary, a place where those suffering from mental illness could find relief away from the cruel and chaotic environments of prisons or poorhouses. But as the years progressed, the patient population swelled far beyond the hospital's capacity. Overcrowding became a serious issue. Wards designed for a limited number of patients became crammed with dozens, sometimes hundreds, of vulnerable individuals. This surge in numbers brought with it a breakdown in the quality of care. Staffing shortages, combined with the limited understanding of mental health at the time, contributed to an environment where neglect and abuse became all too common. Patients were frequently left unattended for long periods. Food and hygiene standards dropped, and discipline often took the form of punishment rather than treatment. As the hospital grew, so did the desperation and suffering within its walls. Reports from former patients and staff paint a grim picture. Physical restraints were commonly used to control patients, sometimes for days or weeks at a time. Punishments ranged from isolation in dark rooms to forced labor under harsh conditions. Experimental treatments, many unproven and dangerous, were administered with little concern for patient safety. In this environment, fear and despair took root, creating a breeding ground for rumors and dark tales. Among the most chilling stories to emerge from Taunton State Hospital is the legend of satanic rituals conducted in the hospital's basement. According to local folklore, a secretive group of nurses was involved in occult practices, using their positions of trust to carry out sinister ceremonies involving patients. The tale speaks of sacrifices and dark magic, whispered about in hushed tones by those who lived nearby or had connections to the hospital. While there is little concrete evidence to confirm these claims, the rumors persisted for decades, fueled by the hospital's eerie atmosphere and history of mistreatment. The basement, rarely accessed and shrouded in shadow, became a place of fearful speculation. Some former employees and patients reported hearing strange noises, chanting screams, and unexplainable sounds emanating from the lower levels. Others spoke of unexplained symbols found carved into walls or scratched into floors. These stories, whether fact or fiction, have become an inseparable part of Taunton State Hospital's dark legacy. Aside from the satanic ritual rumors, the hospital's documented history is rife with other tragedies. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, outbreaks of infectious diseases like tuberculosis and influenza swept through the crowded wards, claiming the lives of many patients. Overwhelmed, staff struggled to contain these epidemics in cramped, poorly ventilated conditions. Death was a constant presence, and many patients were buried in unmarked graves on hospital grounds, their stories lost to time. The hospital's treatment methods reflected the evolving but often brutal understanding of mental illness. Hydrotherapizing patients with hot or cold water was frequently used to calm agitation, while electroconvulsive therapy, sometimes administered without anesthesia, caused intense fear and pain. In later years, lobotomies were performed on select patients, leaving many incapacitated or worse. By the mid-20th century, Taunton State Hospital had become a symbol of the failures of institutional mental health care. Public awareness of the mistreatment inside such facilities increased, fueled by investigative journalism, patient accounts, and changing social attitudes. The move toward deinstitutionalization began to gain traction, emphasizing community-based care over confinement in massive asylums. Despite its troubled history, the hospital continued to operate into the late 20th century, gradually downsizing and shifting focus. It finally closed its doors in 1975, ending over 120 years of operation. However, the physical structures remained, slowly decaying, and the stories of what transpired within continued to haunt the local community. Today, Taunton State Hospital is a site of fascination for paranormal investigators and urban explorers. The decaying buildings and overgrown grounds exude an unsettling aura that seems to echo the pain and suffering endured by its former patients. Visitors report strange phenomena, disembodied voices whispering through empty halls, cold spots that appear without explanation, and the sensation of unseen presences watching from dark corners. Many who explore the hospital claim to hear footsteps echoing in deserted corridors, or see fleeting shadows moving just beyond their line of sight. Some recount sudden feelings of dread or overwhelming sadness in certain rooms, especially near the basement, where the darkest legends originated. Others have experienced objects moving inexplicably or felt touches when no one else is around. Electronic voice phenomena, EVP recordings taken during investigations have picked up faint cries for help, unintelligible murmurs, and even whispered warnings such as leave or don't come back. While skeptics dismiss these as natural or fabricated, the sheer volume of reports has made Taunton State Hospital a hotspot for those drawn to the paranormal. The legend of satanic rituals, though lacking hard evidence, remains one of the most persistent and disturbing stories associated with the hospital. It represents the deep fear and mistrust that can develop in places marked by neglect and suffering. Whether true or simply a product of imagination and rumor, the idea of secret dark ceremonies has become entwined with the hospital's identity, a symbol of the horrors it housed. The story of Taunton State Hospital is a cautionary tale about the dangers of neglect and cruelty in mental health care. It reminds us of the vulnerable individuals who were often forgotten or mistreated in the name of treatment. It speaks to the importance of compassion, oversight, and humanity in caring for those struggling with mental illness. As the hospital buildings continue to crumble and nature reclaims the grounds, the echoes of the past linger. For those who venture close, the weight of history is palpable. The spirits of the forgotten patients, the whispers of untold horrors, and the shadowy legends all combine to make Taunton State Hospital a place where the past refuses to rest. Kings Park Psychiatric Center, located on Long Island, New York, opened its doors in 1885 during a period when mental health care was beginning to shift from mere confinement to treatment. It was originally envisioned as a progressive institution, a place where individuals suffering from mental illnesses could receive compassionate care in a calm, structured environment. The sprawling campus covered over 800 acres, featuring numerous buildings surrounded by wooded areas, designed to provide patients with space and fresh air. At the outset, Kings Park represented hope and reform in a system too often characterized by neglect and cruelty. In its early years, Kings Park Psychiatric Center embraced the principles of moral treatment, a philosophy emphasizing kindness, routine, and therapeutic work. Patients were encouraged to take part in farming, woodworking, and other activities intended to restore mental balance and give them a sense of purpose. The hospital was well-staffed and relatively well-funded, compared to many other institutions at the time, attracting patients from across the region and even from abroad. However, the tides turned as the 20th century progressed. With increasing patient populations, funding shortages, and growing societal stigma surrounding mental illness, Kings Park's atmosphere began to shift. Overcrowding became a persistent issue. This overcrowding, combined with limited staff and resources, bred neglect and despair. Many patients were confined to their rooms or wards for years, with little meaningful interaction or treatment. The hospital's rigid routines and authoritarian atmosphere left many feeling isolated and hopeless. The long-term confinement, often without family visits or outside contact, led many patients to mental deterioration rather than recovery. During this period, the treatment methods used at Kings Park were often harsh and dehumanizing. Lobotomies, a procedure that involved severing connections in the brain's frontal lobes, were performed on numerous patients. Once heralded as a breakthrough treatment for severe mental illness, lobotomies frequently left patients permanently disabled, apathetic, or dead. The hospital was one of the many across the country to adopt this brutal practice enthusiastically during the 1940s and 1950s. Shock therapy, including electroconvulsive therapy, ECT, was another common treatment at Kings Park. While ECT has been refined and continues to be used today under strict guidelines, during Kings Park's heyday, it was often administered without proper anesthesia or safeguards. Patients would be subjected to painful and frightening treatments that caused confusion, memory loss, and trauma. These procedures were often used not just as treatment, but as a means of controlling difficult or non-compliant patients. The combination of overcrowding, brutal treatments, and prolonged confinement pushed many patients into deeper states of madness. Suicide and accidental deaths were common. Records from the hospital reveal many incidents of patients disappearing, being found dead in isolated wards, or succumbing to untreated illnesses exacerbated by the poor conditions. The sheer scale of the institution and the era. A lack of oversight meant that countless patients passed through Kings Park's gates with their stories left untold. Many were buried anonymously in the hospital cemetery on the grounds, their graves marked by simple numbers, their names forgotten. The grounds themselves became a symbol of the lives lost and the suffering endured within the institution's walls. By the late 20th century, public awareness of the failures of large psychiatric hospitals had grown significantly. Investigative reports, lawsuits, and survivor testimonies exposed widespread abuse and neglect at facilities like Kings Park. The national shift toward deinstitutionalization gained momentum, emphasizing community-based mental health care rather than large, isolated institutions. Kings Park Psychiatric Center began a gradual decline, closing buildings and discharging patients. By 1996, the hospital officially closed after more than a century of operation. Much of the property was sold or repurposed, with many of the hospital buildings demolished. However, several structures remain abandoned, standing as silent witnesses to the hospital's troubled past. Even decades after its closure, Kings Park remains a place wrapped in legend and haunted by memories, both literal and figurative. The abandoned buildings have attracted urban explorers and paranormal investigators who report strange and unsettling experiences. Visitors to the site commonly describe eerie sensations, sudden drops in temperature, unexplained noises like footsteps echoing through empty hallways, and whispers carried on the wind. Some have reported seeing shadowy figures darting just beyond the edge of vision, or fleeting glimpses of patients dressed in outdated hospital gowns. Others speak of an overwhelming sense of sadness or despair that hangs heavily in certain rooms. The old hospital cemetery continues to be a focal point for these stories. Many unmarked graves rest there, and some visitors claim to hear disembodied voices calling out, or to feel unseen presences brushing past them. Photographs taken on the grounds occasionally reveal orbs or mist-like shapes that defy logical explanation. Paranormal investigators using electronic devices have captured chilling electronic voice phenomena, EVPs, during their visits. Some recorded phrases include desperate pleas for help, names whispered on the wind, and ominous warnings like "get out" or "stay away." Whether these are echoes of the past or the result of heightened imagination is debated. But the sheer volume of consistent reports has solidified Kings Park's reputation as one of the most haunted former psychiatric hospitals in the United States. Beyond the ghost stories and paranormal activity, the legacy of Kings Park Psychiatric Center serves as a stark reminder of how far mental health care has come and how easily it can fail when compassion and oversight are lacking. It tells the story of thousands of lives affected by outdated methods, institutional neglect, and societal stigma. Today, efforts are underway to preserve parts of the Kings Park grounds as historical sites, acknowledging both the progress made in mental health treatment and the tragic lessons learned from places like this. Former patients' stories are slowly being uncovered, and advocacy groups work to ensure that such neglect is never repeated. Kings Park's story is one of hope, lost and found, a tale of an institution that began with promise but succumbed to the weight of overcrowding, fear, and cruelty. Its haunting presence lingers in the decaying walls and in the memories of those who suffered there. It stands as both a warning and a call to compassion, reminding us that behind every statistic is a human being deserving of dignity and care. St. Albans Sanatorium in Radford, Virginia, carries a legacy as dark and complex as the history of psychiatric care itself. Originally founded in the 1890s as a Lutheran boys' school, the sprawling campus transformed dramatically when it was repurposed as a psychiatric hospital in 1916. Its walls, once filled with the laughter and learning of children, soon echoed with the anguished cries of patients subjected to experimental treatments and cruel conditions. Over the decades, St. Albans gained a grim reputation, not just for the suffering endured within its confines, but for a string of suicides, murders, and botched medical procedures that stained its history. When St. Albans transitioned from a school to a sanatorium, the nation's approach to mental illness was evolving but far from humane. Early hopes that the institution might provide compassionate care were quickly dashed as overcrowding and understaffing set in. The hospital was tasked with housing a growing number of patients suffering from mental disorders, many arriving from across Virginia and neighboring states. The facility's infrastructure, however, was ill-equipped for the influx, and the environment soon became one of neglect and despair. Throughout the early and mid-20th century, St. Albans was notorious for its use of harsh, experimental treatments. Electroconvulsive therapy was administered frequently and often without proper sedation, leaving patients terrified and traumatized. Hydrotherapy immersion in hot or cold water for extended periods was employed as a method to control agitation and calm patients. But perhaps most chilling were the botched procedures that resulted in serious injuries or death. Surgical interventions designed to alleviate symptoms sometimes went horribly wrong, exacerbating patients' suffering rather than alleviating it. The atmosphere within St. Albans was oppressive. The hospital was plagued by reports of neglect, abuse, and violence. Overworked staff struggled to maintain control over the large patient population, many of whom were confined for years or decades, with patients desperate to escape the bleak reality of institutional life. Some accounts tell of patients jumping from upper floors or hanging themselves in locked rooms. Each loss added to the growing aura of sorrow and tragedy that seemed to seep into the very walls of the sanatorium. Murder was not unheard of within St. Albans either. The pressure cooker environment, combined with the hospital's limited security, occasionally led to violent outbreaks. Some patients, driven to madness by their confinement and mistreatment, attacked fellow residents or even staff members. Such incidents were often quietly covered up or downplayed by hospital administration, but they left lasting scars on survivors and the local community. One of the most haunting stories connected to St. Albans is that of a nurse who took her own life on the upper floors of the hospital. Though details are sparse and sometimes contradictory, the tale endures with chilling clarity. This nurse was said to be dedicated and compassionate, but overwhelmed by the horrors she witnessed daily. Unable to escape the weight of her grief and trauma, she ended her life within the building. Since then, many visitors and employees have reported feeling an oppressive presence on the upper floors, where her spirit is believed to linger. Some have even claimed to see a spectral figure dressed in a nurse's uniform, silently pacing the hallways, her sorrow palpable. The sanatorium's abandoned buildings have become a magnet for paranormal enthusiasts and urban explorers, drawn by tales of restless spirits and unexplained phenomena. Visitors report hearing disembodied voices, whispering indistinct words in empty rooms. Doors are known to slam shut abruptly, sometimes trapping people inside or startling them in otherwise silent corridors. Footsteps echo when no one else is present, and cold spots appear suddenly, sending chills down the spine. Apparitions have been seen wandering the grounds. Some appear to be former patients, lost in confusion or pain, while others resemble nurses going about their duties long after death. These ghostly figures sometimes manifest as fleeting shadows or vague shapes, barely visible but unmistakably human. The pervasive feeling of unease and sadness that many experience suggests that the suffering endured at St. Albans did not end with the hospital as closure. The sanatorium officially shut its doors in the late 1980s as part of a broader trend toward deinstitutionalization and community-based mental health care. Many patients were transferred to smaller facilities or released into outpatient programs. The buildings, once filled with life and suffering, were left to decay. Nature has slowly reclaimed the campus, but the echoes of the past remain. Local residents tell stories of hearing strange noises coming from the empty buildings late at night, moans, cries, and footsteps that vanish upon investigation. Several attempts have been made to demolish or renovate parts of the complex, But unexplained accidents and equipment failures have fueled speculation that the place resists change. As if the spirits of those who suffered there still hold sway. In addition to the chilling personal accounts, paranormal investigators have documented phenomena that defy rational explanation. Electronic voice phenomena, EVPs, recorded on-site include faint cries of distress, whispered warnings, and even names called out into the darkness. Some claim to have captured ghostly figures on camera or seen orbs of light that dart through the ruins. While skeptics argue these experiences have logical causes, the volume and consistency of reports have made St. Albans a landmark in Virginia's haunted history. The story of St. Albans Sanatorium is a stark reflection of the evolution and failings of mental health care in America. It highlights how good intentions can be swallowed by systemic neglect, how patients can become prisoners rather than recipients of care, and how the consequences of cruelty and oversight can linger long after the last light is turned off. Today, St. Albans serves as a grim reminder and a solemn monument. Its haunted halls and shadowed grounds stand as silent witnesses to the countless lives forever changed within. Whether through ghostly encounters or the lingering aura of sorrow, the past refuses to be forgotten. The spirit of that nurse on the upper floors, along with the many others who walk those halls, calls out across Tima, haunting testament to pain, resilience, and the urgent need for compassion. Middletown State Homeopathic Hospital in Middletown, New York, opened its doors in 1874 amid great optimism, at a time when mental illness was often met with fear, misunderstanding, and outright cruelty. This hospital promised a new approach, one that embraced the principles of homeopathy, a gentle form of treatment that emphasized minimal intervention and natural healing. The hospital's founders envisioned a place where patients would receive compassionate care, freed from the brutal practices that were common elsewhere. For a time, Middletown State was a beacon of hope and progress in psychiatric care. The hospital's architecture reflected these ideals. Set on sprawling grounds with manicured lawns, gardens, and airy wards, it was designed to provide patients with a therapeutic environment. The philosophy was that fresh air, kindness, and non-invasive remedies could restore balance to troubled minds. Early treatments focused on homeopathic remedies, diluted natural substances meant to stimulate the body's healing response, combined with rest, nutrition, and occupational therapy. But despite these hopeful beginnings, the promise of kindness was difficult to maintain in practice. The realities of increasing patient numbers, limited funding, and societal stigma soon overwhelmed the hospital's idealistic mission. As the decades passed, Middletown State Homeopathic Hospital, like many institutions of its era, began to mirror the grim conditions seen elsewhere in mental health care. Overcrowding quickly became a critical issue. The hospital was originally built to hold around 350 patients. With the increase in patient numbers, came a shift away from gentle homeopathic treatments toward harsher, more conventional methods. The rise of electroconvulsive therapy, isolation rooms, and sedative drugs marked a turning point. These treatments, often administered without consent or adequate safeguards, caused trauma and fear among patients. The early philosophy of healing through kindness was gradually supplanted by a system of control and containment. Neglect became rampant. Patients were sometimes left unattended for hours or days. Hygiene standards slipped, and the spread of infectious diseases was a constant threat. Malnutrition, unsanitary conditions, and lack of medical care led to many preventable deaths. The hospital cemetery grew steadily as countless patients died within the institution's walls, many buried anonymously or in unmarked graves. Accounts from former patients and staff, recorded later in the 20th century, paint a bleak picture. Stories of physical restraints, forced confinement in padded cells, and verbal abuse emerged. Many patients felt like prisoners, forgotten by family and society. The atmosphere was heavy with despair and loneliness, and suicide attempts were tragically frequent. Despite these grim realities, the hospital did see moments of progress. Some staff members remained committed to the original mission of compassionate care, advocating for reforms and better treatments. They introduced occupational therapy programs, art and music sessions, and attempted to improve living conditions. However, their efforts were often undermined by the systemic problems inherent in large state-run institutions of the time. By mid-century, with the advent of new psychiatric medications and a growing movement toward deinstitutionalization, Middletown State began to decline. Patients were gradually moved to community-based facilities or discharged with outpatient support, reflecting a broader shift in mental health care philosophy. The hospital's sprawling campus was slowly abandoned, buildings falling into disrepair as the patient population dwindled. The hospital officially closed in the late 1970s, ending over a century of operation. Yet, the echoes of its troubled past have never fully faded. The decaying buildings and overgrown grounds stand as silent monuments to the lives lost and the suffering endured within. For many locals and paranormal enthusiasts, Middletown State Homeopathic Hospital has become a site of eerie fascination. Known for strange occurrences and reported hauntings, visitors to the abandoned hospital often describe a chilling atmosphere, thick with the weight of history. People report hearing footsteps in empty hallways, the faint sound of whispers, and unexplained noises like doors creaking or slamming. Some claim to see shadowy figures moving just beyond their field of vision, or to feel cold spots that appear suddenly in warm rooms. Paranormal investigators have captured electronic voice phenomena, EVPs, during night explorations, ghostly voices, pleading for help or murmuring indistinct phrases. Others have photographed orbs and mist-like shapes that defy explanation. Whether these are the restless spirits of former patients or simply the power of suggestion, the hospital's haunted reputation continues to grow. Local lore also speaks of particular rooms or wards where the presence of past suffering feels especially strong. These areas are said to trigger overwhelming feelings of sadness, fear, or oppression in visitors. Some believe that the unresolved pain of those who died at Middletown State Homeopathic Hospital has imprinted itself on the physical space, binding them to the site. The story of Middletown State Homeopathic Hospital is a microcosm of the broader history of psychiatric care in America, narrative of hopeful beginnings crushed under the weight of overcrowding, misunderstanding, and neglect. It reminds us of how far treatment has come and how much work remains to ensure dignity and compassion for those struggling with mental illness. Today, efforts by historians and preservationists seek to document and remember the hospital's history, not to glorify the suffering, but to honor the lives affected and learn from past mistakes. Middletown State Homeopathic Hospital stands as a cautionary tale, a place where hope and horror coexisted, and where the echoes of the past continue to whisper through empty halls. Harlem Valley Psychiatric Center, located in Wingdale, New York, opened in 1924 as part of a wave of state-funded mental health institutions designed to provide care for thousands suffering from psychiatric disorders. Spanning hundreds of acres, the hospital quickly grew to become one of the largest psychiatric centers in the state. At its peak, the sprawling campus housed thousands of patients within its countless buildings, offering hope for treatment in an era when mental illness was still widely misunderstood. Initially, Harlem Valley was seen as a modern facility equipped to deliver the latest treatments and therapies. However, as the decades passed, it gained a notorious reputation for its heavy reliance on electroshock therapy and lobotomies, procedures that were invasive, traumatic, and often left patients physically and mentally devastated. These methods were widely used throughout much of the 20th century. But at Harlem Valley, they were implemented on a massive scale. Electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT, was administered frequently, sometimes without full anesthesia or consent, leaving many patients frightened and disoriented. The procedure induced seizures to reset the brain, but often resulted in memory loss and lasting trauma. Lobotomies, involving severing connections in the brain's frontal lobe, were also performed regularly at Harlem Valley, especially during the 1940s and 1950s. Though once considered a breakthrough, lobotomies frequently led to severe disability or death. The massive size of the hospital meant patients were often treated as numbers rather than individuals. Overcrowding became a chronic issue, with the facility housing far more people than it was designed to accommodate. Long-term confinement, coupled with harsh treatments and isolation from family, caused many patients to deteriorate both mentally and physically. The hospital grounds themselves became a labyrinth of buildings, corridors, and underground tunnels. These tunnels connected various parts of the facility, allowing staff to move supplies and bodies discreetly, out of sight from patients and visitors. The vast network of tunnels and shadowy halls contributes to the eerie atmosphere that now surrounds the abandoned complex. Harlem Valley Psychiatric Center finally closed its doors in 1994, amid broader shifts toward deinstitutionalization and changes in mental health care policy. The closure marked the end of an era, but it left behind a sprawling, decaying campus, a haunted reminder of the suffering and neglect that once permeated the institution. Today, the hospital is a magnet for urban explorers, paranormal investigators, and thrill-seekers drawn to its dark history. Visitors who dare to enter the abandoned buildings report intense feelings of sadness and fear that seem to cling to the air itself. Many describe shadowy figures lurking just beyond their vision, ghostly forms that vanish when looked at directly. Disembodied voices are a common occurrence, with many hearing faint whispers that sound like patients calling out for help or warning intruders to stay with us. The overwhelming sense of despair reported by visitors suggests that the pain of those who suffered here still resonates within the walls. Paranormal investigators have documented numerous phenomena during their explorations. Electronic voice phenomena, EVPs, have captured chilling messages, some clearly pleading or begging for release. Cold spots, sudden, unexplained drops in temperature occur frequently, causing chills even in warm weather. Objects have been seen moving on their own, sliding across floors or rattling in place without any visible cause. One of the most haunted areas of Harlem Valley is its morgue. The cold, sterile room, where deceased patients were stored, has become infamous for paranormal activity. Visitors report hearing loud metallic banging noises echoing through the empty space, as if unseen hands are slamming drawers or striking surfaces. Some have witnessed gurneys rolling slowly across the floor without anyone nearby, seemingly pushed by invisible forces. The morgue's eerie reputation is heightened by the hospital's tragic history of untimely deaths, many of which were shrouded in mystery or left undocumented. The anonymity of many patients, combined with the secrecy surrounding deaths at the hospital, adds to the chilling atmosphere. Despite the hospital's closure and gradual decay, nature has not yet fully reclaimed the grounds. Overgrown vegetation creeps through cracks in the pavement and walls, but the buildings remain standing silent sentinels to a dark past. Their windows are shattered, roofs collapse, and hallways are filled with debris. Yet the presence of something unseen lingers. The story of Harlem Valley Psychiatric Center is a microcosm of the troubled history of institutional mental health care in America. It is a place where hope for healing was often lost amid overcrowding, fear, and harsh treatments. The ghosts that remain, whether real or imagined, serve as a reminder of the countless lives affected, many of whom were never truly seen or heard. For those who venture into the ruins of Harlem Valley today, the experience is more than just exploration. It is a confrontation with history. The sadness, fear, and restless spirits that reportedly inhabit the hospital challenge visitors to remember the past honestly and compassionately. The legacy of Harlem Valley is complex. It is a story of medical advances and mistakes, of hope and tragedy, of care and cruelty. Its haunted halls call out not just with ghostly whispers, but with a powerful message that those who suffer in silence deserve to be remembered, and that the mistakes of the past must guide us toward more humane treatment in the future. And there you have it, 20 of the most haunted hospitals in America, places where the echoes of agony never fade and the walls themselves seem to breathe with sorrow. These buildings were meant to heal, to offer hope, but instead they became prisons of despair, where the living suffered and the dead refused to leave. If you ever feel brave enough to visit one of these sites, remember, ghosts aren't bound by walls. They don't need doors or windows. They can follow you home. A whisper in the night, a shadow at the foot of your bed, a cold hand brushing your arm when you're all alone. So as you turn off the lights tonight, listen carefully. That creak on the floorboard, was it the house settling? Or something else? Something that heard us speaking its name and decided to pay you a visit. Thank you for joining me on this chilling journey into America's most haunted hospitals. If you enjoyed this, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more tales that keep you up at night. And tell me in the comments which of these hospitals would you dare to explore, and which one would you never set foot in. Until next time, sleep well, if you can.